Seeing their reaction shook me, and I made an effort to get a grip on myself. I drew a deep breath and closed my eyes. The moment of strange disorientation passed, though my boots still felt hard and heavy on my feet. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Hespa looking up at me. She spoke hesitantly.
Pretty important though, so that's a pretty important thing not to do well.
Kvothe, she said hesitantly. You look...
I'm
well.
Gonna have to get used to it.
I smiled wide. I am. We thought you were
doing? And why this guy's
lost.
lagging everywhere? How am I supposed to kill this guy?
You thought I was gone, I corrected gently, as I made my way to the fireplace where Martin stood. Dead in Felurian's arms or wandering the forest, mad and broken with desire. I looked at them each in turn. Isn't that right? I felt the whole room's eyes on me and decided to make the most of the situation. Come now. I am Kvothe. I am Edema Ruh born. I have studied at the university and can call down lightning like Taborlin the Great. Did you really think Felurian would be the death of me?
Yeah, we came second place yesterday.
She would be.
We came first, but we came second,
said a rough voice from the edge of the hearth. If you had ever so much as seen her shadow. I turned to see the hawk-faced fiddler.
This is primetime meat.
I beg your pardon, sir? You should beg the pardon of everyone here,
my prime time,
he said, his voice dripping with disdain. I don't know what you hope to gain from this, but I don't believe the lot of you saw Felurian. Not for a second. I met his eyes.
I don't team with them anymore.
I did more than see her, friend. If that were true, then you'd be mad now, or dead. And while I'll admit you might be mad, it's not from any fairy charm. The room chuckled at this. No one has seen her in a score of years. The fair folk have left this place behind, and you're no Taborlin, no matter what your friends say. I'm guessing you're just a clever storyteller hoping to make a name for himself. That struck uncomfortably close to the mark, and I could see some of the crowd eyeing me skeptically. Before I could say anything, Dedan burst in.
Dude.
What about his beard, then? When he ran off 3 nights ago, his face was smooth as a baby's arse. So you say, the fiddler replied.
Come on.
I was going to keep quiet, even though I didn't believe half of what you told us about those bandits or him calling the lightning. But I thought to myself, their friend probably died and they want folks to remember him with a proud story or two. He looked down his broken nose to where Dedan sat.
Right? There's no way.
But really, this has gone too far. It's not wise to tell lies about the fair folk. I don't appreciate strangers coming here and spinning my friends' heads full of nonsense.
Oh, shit.
Be quiet, the lot of you. We've heard enough out of you tonight. Having said his piece, the fiddler opened the battered case that sat next to him and drew out his instrument. The mood of the room had grown vaguely hostile by this point, and more than a few people eyed me resentfully. Dedan sputtered angrily. Now listen here! Hespa said something, and tried to pull him down into his seat, but Dedan shook her off. No!
It sounds so much
I won't be called a liar. We were sent here by Alvaron himself because of them bandits, and we did our job. We're not expecting a parade, but I'll be damned before I let you call me a liar. We killed those bastards, and afterward, we did see Felurian, and Kvothe there did take off after her. Dedan glared around the room belligerently, mostly in the direction of the fiddler. That's the truth, and I swear it by my good right hand. If anyone wants to call me a liar, we can have it out right now.
Queen Elizabeth just died, yes,
The fiddler picked up his bow and met Dedan's eye. He drew a screaming note across the strings. Liar! Dedan nearly leapt across the room as people pushed their chairs back to make a clear space for the fight. The fiddler came to his feet slowly. He was taller than I'd expected, with short gray hair and scarred knuckles that told me he knew his way around a fistfight.
She was like 90.
I managed to get in front of Dedan and leaned against him, speaking low in his ear. Do you really want to brawl with a broken arm? If he gets hold of it, you'll just scream and piss yourself in front of Hespa. I felt him relax a bit, and gave him a gentle push back toward his seat. He went, but he wasn't happy. Something here, I heard a woman say behind me. If you want to have a scuff with someone, you take it outside and don't bother coming back. You don't get paid to fight the customers, you hear? Now, Penny, the fiddler said soothingly, I was just showing some teeth to him.
That's probably true.
He's the one took it all personal. You can't blame me for making fun with the sort of stories they come in with. I turned around and saw the fiddler explaining himself to an angry woman in her middle years. She was a full foot shorter than him and had to reach up to jab his chest with a finger. That's when I heard a voice exclaim to one side of me. God's mother, Seb! You see that? Look at it! It's moving by itself! You're blind drunk. It's just a breeze. There ain't no wind in tonight. It's moving itself. Look again! It was my shade, of course. By now, several people had noticed it blowing gently in a breeze that wasn't there. I thought the effect was rather nice, but I could tell by their wide eyes that folk were becoming alarmed. One or two slid their chairs away from me uneasily. Penny's eyes were fixed on my gently flowing shade, and she walked over to stand in front of me. What is it? She asked, her voice showing just a hint of fear. Nothing to worry over, I said easily, holding out a fold of it for her inspection. It is my shadow cloak. Felurian made it for me. The fiddler made a disgusted noise.
Oh, what a
Penny
banger,
shot him
bro,
a
what
look
banger.
and hesitantly brushed my cloak with a hand. It's soft, she murmured, looking up at me. When our eyes met, she looked surprised for a moment, then exclaimed, You're Losey's boy! Before I could ask what she meant, I heard a woman's voice say, What?
Dude,
I turned to see a red-haired serving girl moving toward us, the same one who had embarrassed me so badly on our first visit to the Pennyworth.
Dude!
Penny nodded toward me. It's your fresh-faced, fiery boy from about 3 span back.
I'm so happy
You remember
searched
pointing
that.
him out to me? I didn't recognize him with the beard. Losey came to stand in front of me. Bright red curls tumbled over the bare, pale skin of her shoulders. Her dangerous green eyes
get a
swept
dime
over my
solo queue?
shade and made their slow
Yeah,
way
you
up to
don't
my
solo
face.
queue.
It's him, all
That's probably
right,
the easiest way to say
she
it.
said sideways to Penny. Beard or no? She took a step closer, almost pressing against me. Boys are always wearing beards and hoping it will make them men.
I said yesterday that I was going to
Her
warm up
bright
costume, but I
emerald
didn't.
eyes settled boldly onto mine, as if expecting me to blush and fumble about as I had before.
Boom, boom, boom.
I thought of everything I'd learned at the hands of Felurian, and felt the strange, wild laughter welling up in me again. I fought it down as best I could, but I could feel it tumbling around inside me as I met her eye and smiled. Losey took a startled half-step back,
No,
her
it's not
pale
true.
skin blushing to a furious red.
I'm playing with somebody else.
Penny
tomorrow.
held out a hand to steady her. Lord, girl, what's the matter with you? Losey tore her eyes away from me. Look at him, Penny. Really, look at him. He's got a fey look about him. Look at his eyes. Penny looked curiously at my face, then flushed a bit herself, and crossed her arms in front of her
What's up,
chest,
Fire?
as if I had seen her naked.
That works, right?
Merciful Lord, she said breathlessly. It's all true,
Change your
then,
name.
isn't it?
Maybe what's going on
Every
there?
word,
What was that hair?
I said.
I just didn't put it back.
How did you get away from her? Penny asked.
I've always had
Oh,
it.
come
I
on,
just-
Penny, the fiddler cried out in disbelief. You aren't buying this pup
sometimes I
story,
have
are
it,
you?
sometimes I don't. No man bun?
Losey turned
right
and
now.
spoke hotly. There's a look a man has when he knows his way around a woman, Ben Creighton. Not that you would know. When this one was here a couple span ago, I liked his face and thought I'd have a roll with him. But when I tried to trip him... She trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. I remember that, a man at the bar called out. Funniest damn thing. I thought he was going to piss himself. He couldn't say a word to her.
Go to raves? Oh,
The
no.
fiddler shrugged. So he found some farmer's
Raves are
daughter
kinda
since
nasty,
then.
no bullshit.
It don't mean... Hush, Ben, Penny said with quiet authority. There's more changed
It's
here
good
than a
bump-up
bit of
music,
beard
though.
can account for. Her eyes searched my face. Lord, but you're right,
It's good
girl.
pump-up music. But I
There
do not
is a
go to
fey
raves.
look about him. The fiddler started to speak again, but Penny shot him a sharp look. "Hush or get out! I don't want any fights in here tonight." The fiddler looked around the room and saw the tide had turned against him. Red-faced and scowling, he gathered up his fiddle and stormed out. Losi stepped close to me again, brushing her hair back. Was she really as beautiful as they say? Her chin went up proudly. More beautiful than me. I hesitated, then spoke softly. She was Felurian, most beautiful of all. I reached out to brush the side of her neck where her red hair began its curling tumble downward, then leaned forward and whispered 7 words into her ear. For all that, she lacked your fire. And she loved me for those 7 words, and her pride was safe. Penny spoke up.
Just me, but
How did you manage to get away?
Cool and all.
I looked around the room
Not
and
really,
felt
actually,
everyone's
but
attention settle onto
I
me.
understand, people take
The
drugs,
wild,
but
fey laughter tumbled around
the
inside
drugs
me.
that people be taking
I
at raves,
smiled
bro,
a
they just
lazy
make you,
smile. My shade billowed.
Mm-mm.
Then I moved to the front of the room,
Mm-mm.
sat on the hearth, and told them the story. Or rather, I told them a story. If I told them the entire truth, they wouldn't have believed it. Felurian let me go because I was holding a song hostage. It simply didn't fit the classic lines. So,
That's
what
how
I
the saying
told
goes.
them was closer to the story they expected to hear. In that story, I chased Felurian into the Fae, our bodies tangled together in her twilight glade. Then, as we rested, I played her music light enough to make her laugh, music dark enough to make her gasp, music sweet enough to make her weep. But when I tried to leave the Fae, she would not let me. She was too fond of my artistry. I shouldn't be coy, I suppose.
But yeah,
I implied rather
Prayers are
strongly
not-
that
prayers are not for me.
Felurian thought quite highly of me as a lover.
it's gross.
I offer no apology for this behavior except to say that I was a young man of 16,
Music's-
proud of my
music's
newfound
pretty good
skills,
sometimes.
and not above a little
I don't
bragging.
really listen to that kind of music, to be honest.
I told them how Felurian had tried
Really
to
just
trap
listen to
me in
rap
the
music.
Fae, how we fought with magic.
Where does everybody
For
go?
this,
Wait, hold
I
up.
borrowed a
There's
little
like
from
one
Tamerlane the
coming
Great.
into
There was fire and lightning.
Huh?
At the end, I bested Felurian, but spared her life. In her gratitude, she wove me a fairy cloak, taught me secret magics, and gave me a silver leaf as a token of her favor. The leaf was pure fabrication, of course, but it wouldn't have been a proper story if she hadn't given me 3 gifts. All in all, it was a good story, and if it wasn't entirely true, well, at least it had some truth mixed in. In my defense, I could have dispensed with the truth entirely and told a much better story. Lies are
runs
simpler,
into a building
and
and
most of the
instantly starts
time
throwing
they make
grenades?
better sense.
What is that shit?
Losi watched me all through the telling, and seemed to take the whole thing as something of a challenge to the prowess of mortal women. After the story was over, she laid claim to me and led me to her small room on the topmost floor of the Pennyworth. I managed very little sleep that night, and Losi came closer to killing me than Felurian ever had. She was a delightful partner, every bit as wonderful as Felurian had been. But how could that be, I hear you ask? How could any mortal
Insane.
woman
What's it
compare
for me?
with Felurian? It's easier to understand if you think of it in terms of music. Sometimes a man enjoys a symphony. Else times he finds a jig more suited to his taste. The same holds true for lovemaking. One type is suited to the deep cushions of a twilight forest glade. Another comes quite naturally tangled in the sheets of narrow beds upstairs in inns. Each woman is like an instrument waiting to be learned, loved, and finally played, to have at last her own true music made. Some might take offense at this way of seeing things,
So
not
what's the
understanding
thing with
how
all
a
the
trooper
babes?
views his music.
That's the
They might
second team
think
in
I
a row.
degrade women. They might consider me callous or boorish or crude. But those people do not understand love or music or me.
So first day
Chapter
was
108.
3rd place,
Quick.
and then the term after that was
We
4th
spent a
place,
few
and then
days
because
at the
those terrible
Pennyworth
scrims
while
that
our
we
welcome
just
was
shouldn't
warm.
count, 'cause
We
they
had our
didn't
own
have human
rooms
beings
and
in them. I
all
don't
our
know
meals
what
for
they were.
free. Fewer
And
bandits
then
meant safer roads
yesterday
and
was
more
second.
customers, and Penny knew our presence at the
3,
inn
4,
would
and
draw a better
2.
crowd than fiddle playing any night.
What's up, Coach?
We put the time to good use, enjoying hot meals and soft beds. All of us could use the time to mend. Hespa was still nursing her arrow-shot leg, Dedan his broken arm. My own minor injuries from the fight with the bandits were long since gone, but I had newer ones, mostly consisting of a heavily scratched back. I taught Tempi the basics of the lute, and he resumed teaching me how to fight. My training consisted of short, terse discussions concerning the Lethani and long, strenuous periods of practicing the Khaitan. I also pieced together a song about my Felurian experience.
Yikes.
I originally called it In Twilight Versed, which, you have to admit, wasn't a very good title. Luckily, the name didn't stick, and these days, most folk know it as The Song Half Sung. It wasn't my best work, but it was easy to remember. The customers at the inn seemed to enjoy it, and when I heard Losi whistling it as she served drinks, I knew it would spread like a fire in a seam of coal. Since folk kept asking for stories, I shared a few other interesting events from my life. I told them how I'd managed to get admitted into the university when I was barely 15 years old. I told them how I'd gained entry to the Arcanum in a mere 3 days' time. I told them how I had called the name of the wind in a furious rage after Ambrose broke my lute. Unfortunately, by the third night, I was out of true stories, and, since my audience was still hungry for more, I simply stole a story about Ilion and put myself in his place instead, stealing a few pieces from Tamerlane while I was at it.
I just knew it was something with a sight in there.
I'm not proud of that, and in my defense I'd like to say I'd had quite a bit to drink. What's more, there were a few pretty women in my audience. There is something powerfully beguiling about the excited eyes of a young woman. They can pull all manner of nonsense out of a foolish young man, and I was no exception to this rule. Meanwhile, Dedan and Hespa occupied the small, exclusive world new lovers make for themselves.
Can I find some people?
They were a delight to watch. Dedan was gentler, quieter. Hespa's face lost much of its hardness. They spent a great deal of time in their room, catching up on their sleep, no doubt. Martin flirted outrageously with Penny, drank enough to drown a fish, and generally enjoyed himself enough for any 3 men.
This can go really bad for
We
me,
left the Pennyworth after 3 days, not wanting to wear our welcome thin. I, for one, was glad to go. Between Tempi's training and Losi's attentions, I was nearly dead from exhaustion. We made slow time on the road back to Severin.
Didn't go that bad.
Part of this was out of concern for Hespa's injured leg, but some of it was because we knew our time together was drawing to an end. Despite our difficulties, we had become close, and it is hard to leave such things behind. News of our adventures had run ahead of us on the road, so when we stopped for the night, our meals and beds were easy to come by, if not free. On our 3rd day out of the Pennyworth, we ran across a small troop of performers. They weren't a Dimaru and looked rather out at the heels. There were just 4 of them, an older fellow, 2 men in their 20s, and a boy of 8 or 9. They were packing up their rickety cart just as we were stopping to give Hespa's leg a bit of a rest. "Hello, the troopers!" I called out. They looked up nervously, then relaxed as they saw the lute across my back. "Hello, the bard!" I laughed and shook their hands. "No bard here, just a bit of a singer." "Hello, the same," the older man said, smiling. "Which way are you heading?" "North to south. Yourself?" They relaxed further once they knew I was heading in a different direction. "East to west," he said. "How's your luck been?"
Who fucking
He shrugged.
tells that?
"Poor enough lately. But we've heard tell of a Lady Chalker who lives 2 days off. They say she never turns a man away if he can fiddle a bit or mum a play. We hope to come off with a penny or 2. "Things were better when we had the bear," one of the younger men said. "Folk'll pay to see a bear bait." "Went sick of a dog bite," the other man complained to me. "Died near a year ago." "That's a shame," I said. "Bear's hard to come by." They nodded a silent agreement. "I've got a new song for you. What will you trade me for it?" He eyed me warily. "Well now, new to you isn't exactly new to us," he pointed out. And a new song ain't necessarily a good song, if you know what I
From
mean.
the McKay family?
Judge
Hell
for
no.
yourself,
I'm
I
gonna
said,
gang for
as I
life.
uncased my lute. I'd written it to be easy to remember and simple to sing, but I still had to repeat it twice before he caught all of it. As I've said, they weren't a Demaroo. A good enough song, he admitted grudgingly. Everyone likes Felurian, but I don't know what we can trade you for it. The young boy piped up. I made up a verse to Tinker Tanner.
Even on Valorant?
The others tried to hush him, but I smiled. I'd love to hear it. The boy puffed himself up and sang out in a piping voice. I once saw a fair farmer's daughter on the riverbank far from all men. She was taking a bath when I saw her. She said she didn't feel right if a man caught a sight, so she soaped herself slowly all over again. I laughed. That's good, I complimented him. But how about this?
Okay.
I once saw a fair farmer's daughter on the riverbank far from all men. She confessed to me once when I caught her that she didn't feel clean if her bathing was seen, so she washed herself over again. The boy thought about it. I like mine better, he said after a moment's consideration. I patted him on the back. It's a good man that sticks to his own verse. I turned back to the leader of the little troop. Any gossip? He thought for a moment. Bandits north of here in the Eld. I nodded. They've been cleared out now, so I've heard. He thought some more.
Damn it, give me a gun.
I heard Elveron's getting married to the Lackless woman. I know a poem about Lackless. The young boy chimed in again and began. 7 things stand before the entrance to the Lackless door. Hush! The older man cuffed the boy gently alongside of his head. He looked up apologetically.
It's coming off too natural.
Boy's got a good ear, but not one lick of
American.
manners.
I can't even, that's not even...
Actually,
me,
I said, I'd like to hear it. He shrugged and let go of the boy, who glared at him before reciting. 7 things stand before the entrance to the Lackless door. 1 of them a ring unworn, 1 a word that is forsworn, 1 a time that must be right, 1 a candle without light, 1 a son who brings the blood, 1 a door that holds the flood, 1 a thing tight held in keeping, then comes that which comes with sleeping.
Thing you're doing there, eh?
It's one of those riddle rhymes, the father said apologetically. Lord knows where he hears them, but he knows better than to go spouting every lewd thing he hears. Where did you hear it? I asked. The boy thought for a moment, then shrugged and began to scratch himself behind his knee. You know, kids, we should be getting on, the older man said, looking up at the sky.
No, I don't.
I dug into my purse and handed him a silver noble. What's this, then? He asked, eyeing it suspiciously.
Ooh, that's not good there, bud.
To help with a new bear, I said. I've been through some tight times, too. But I'm flush now. They left after thanking me profuse. Poor fellows.
You're such a bitch.
No self-respecting Roo troop would ever stoop to bear baiting.
What is that?
There was no skill involved, no pride in the performance. But they could hardly be blamed for their lack of Roo blood, and we troopers have to watch out for each other. No one else does. Tempe and I used our walking hours to discuss the Lethani and evenings to practice the K-10. It was becoming easier for me, and I could sometimes make it as far as catching rain before Tempe caught some minuscule mistake and made me start over. The 2 of us had found a halfway secluded place beside the inn where we had stopped for the day. Dedan, Hespa, and Martin were inside drinking. I worked my way carefully through the K-10 while Tempe sat with his back to a tree practicing a basic fingering drill I had taught him with relentless determination. Over and over. Over and over.
We have one?
I had just made it through circling hands when I caught a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. I did not pause, as Tempe had taught me to avoid distraction while performing the K-10. If I turned to look, I would have to start over again.
The Merca accent.
Moving with painful slowness, accent. I began dance backwards.
Then British and
but as
English,
soon as I placed my heel, I could tell my balance was wrong. I waited for Tempe to call out, but he didn't. I stopped the K-10 and turned to see a group of 4 ADEM mercenaries walking toward us with a prowling grace. Tempe was already on his feet and walking toward them. My loot was back in its case and leaning up against the side of the tree.
Thanks, Wanted.
Soon, the 5 of them were standing in a tight group, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Close enough that I couldn't hear the barest whisper of what they were saying, or even see their hands.
Whenever somebody tries to
But I could tell from the angle of Tempe's shoulders that he was uncomfortable, defensive. I knew calling out to Tempe would be considered rude, so I walked over. But before I came close enough to hear, one of the unfamiliar mercenaries stretched out a hand and pushed me away, his spread fingers pressing firmly against the center of my chest. Without thinking, I made Break Lion, taking hold of his thumb and turning his wrist away from me. He loosened his hand from mine without any apparent effort and moved to trip me with Chasing Stone. I made dance backwards and got the balance right this time, but his other hand struck me in the temple just enough to dizzy me for half a second, not hard enough to even hurt. My pride stung, though. It was the same way Tempe struck me in silent rebuke for sloppy performance of the K-10. Quick, the mercenary said softly in a Turan. It was only when I heard her voice that I realized she was a woman. Not that she was particularly masculine, it was simply that she seemed so similar to Tempe. She had the same sandy hair, pale gray eyes, calm expression, blood-red clothes. She was taller than Tempe by a few inches, and her shoulders were broader than his. But while she was whipcord thin, the tightness of her mercenary reds still revealed the lean curves of hip and breast. Looking more closely, I could easily see 3 of the 4 mercenaries were women. The broad-shouldered one facing me had a thin scar cutting through her eyebrow and another close to her jaw. They were the same pale silver scars Tempe had on his arms and chest. And while they were far from gruesome, they made her expressionless face look oddly grim. Quick, she had said. On the surface, it seemed to be a compliment, but I've been mocked enough in my life to recognize it, regardless of the language. Even worse, her right hand slid all the way around to rest in the small of her back, palm facing out. Even with my rudimentary knowledge of ADEM hand talk, I knew what that meant. Her hand was as far as it could possibly get from the hilt of her sword. At the same time, she turned her shoulder to me and looked away. I wasn't just being declared unthreatening. This was insultingly dismissive. I fought to keep my face calm, guessing any expression would only further lower her opinion of me. Tempe pointed back where I had come from. Go, he said, serious, formal. I reluctantly obeyed, not wanting to make a scene. The ADEM stood in a close knot a quarter hour as I practiced the K-10. Though I didn't hear a whisper of their conversation, it was obvious they were arguing. Their gestures were sharp and angry, the placement of their feet aggressive. Eventually, the 4 unfamiliar ADEM left, walking back toward the road. Tempe returned to where I was trying to work my way through threshing wheat. Too wide. Irritation. He tapped my back leg and pushed my shoulder to show my balance was lacking. I moved my foot and tried again. Who were they, Tempe? ADEM, he said simply, sitting himself back down at the foot of the tree.
Sites don't exist anymore.
Did you know them? Yes. Tempe looked around, then brought my loot out of its case. With his hands occupied, he was doubly mute. I went back to practicing the K-10, knowing that trying to pry answers out of him would be like pulling teeth. 2 hours passed, and the sun began to sink behind the western trees. Tomorrow I leave, he said. With both his hands still on the loot, I could only guess at his mood. Where?
Dude, this is
to Heard. To Cheyenne. Are those cities? Heard is city. Cheyenne is my teacher. I had given some thought to what might be the matter.
My far range is so bad. Like, how
Are you in trouble for teaching me?
On that seer?
He set the loot back in the case and pressed the lid back in place.
That was how I got better
Perhaps.
yesterday. I need to do it again.
Yes.
Who's there to 1v1?
Is it forbidden? It is most forbidden, he said. Tempe stood and began the K-10. I followed him, and both of us were quiet for a while. How much trouble? I asked eventually. Most trouble, he said, and I heard an uncharacteristic shred of emotion in his voice. Anxiety. It was perhaps unwise. Together, we moved as slowly as the setting sun. I thought of what the Cathay had said. The one shred of potentially useful information it had let slip in our conversation. You laughed at fairies until you saw one. Small wonder all your civilized neighbors dismissed the Chandrian as well. You'd have to leave your precious corners far behind before you found someone who might take you seriously. You wouldn't have a hope until you made it to the storm wall. Valorian had said the Cathay only spoke the truth. Could I accompany you? I asked. Accompany? Tempe asked, his hands moving in a graceful circle intended to break the long bones of the arm. Travel with. Follow. To Hert. Yes. Would it help your trouble? Yes.
G2, NRG,
I will come.
Luminosity, Renegades, E8,
I thank you.
I don't know what the fuck that is.
Chapter 109. Barbarians and Madmen.
There's a lot of good
Truthfully,
teams.
I wanted nothing
tomorrow.
more than to make my way back to Severin. I wanted to sleep in a bed again and take advantage of the mayor's favor while it was still fresh in his mind.
I'm not.
I wanted to find Denna and make things right between us. But Tempe was in trouble for teaching me. I couldn't simply run off and leave him to face that by himself. What's more, the Cathay had told me Denna had already left Severin behind, though I hardly needed a prophetic fairy to tell me that. I'd been gone for a month, and Denna was never the sort to let grass grow under her feet. So the next morning, our group parted ways. Dedan, Hespa, and Martin were going south to Severin to report to the mayor and collect their pay. Tempe and I were heading northeast toward the storm wall and Ademre. You sure you don't want me to take him the box? Dedan asked for the 5th time. I promised the mayor I'd return any monies to him personally. I lied. But I do need you to give him this. I handed the big mercenary the letter I'd written the night before. It explains why I had to make you the leader of the group, I grinned. You might get a bonus out of it. Dedan puffed up importantly as he took hold of the letter. Standing nearby, Martin made a noise that could have been a cough. As Tempe and I traveled, I managed to coax a few details from the mercenary. Eventually, I learned it was customary for someone of his social standing to gain permission before he took a student of his own. Complicating matters was the fact that I was an outsider, a barbarian. In teaching a person like me, it seems like Tempe had done more than violate a custom. He had broken a trust with his teacher and his people.
How the fuck is there a guy up there?
Will there be a trial of some sort? I asked. He shook his head. No trial. Cheyenne will ask me questions. I will say,
Hair?
I saw in Quoth good iron
Put
waiting.
my hair down.
He is of Lethani. He needs Lethani to guide him. Tempe nodded at me. Cheyenne will ask you of the Lethani, to see if I were right in my seeing. Cheyenne will decide if you are iron worth striking. His hand circled, making the gesture for uneasy. And what will happen if I am not? I asked. For you? Uncertainty. For me? I will be cut away. Cut away? I asked, hoping I misunderstood. He held up a hand and wiggled his fingers. Them. He made a tight fist and shook it. Ademre.
Great.
Then he opened his hand and touched his little finger. Tempe. He touched the other fingers. Friend, brother, mother. He touched the thumb. Shayin. Then he made a gesture as if paring off his little finger and throwing it away. Got away, he said. Not killed then, but exiled. I started to breathe easier until I looked in Tempe's pale eyes. For just a moment, there was a crack in his perfect, placid mask, and behind it I saw the truth. Death would be a kinder punishment than being cut away.
Don't really look at my chat
He
during,
was terrified,
competitive.
as frightened as anyone I had ever seen. We agreed our best hope was for me to put myself entirely in Tempe's hands during the trip to Haert. I had approximately 15 days to polish what I knew to a bright shine. The hope being that when I met Tempe's superiors, I could make a good impression. Before we began that first day, Tempe instructed me to put my shade away. Reluctantly, I did so. It folded down into a surprisingly small bundle that stowed easily into my travel sack. The pace Tempe set was grueling. First, the two of us moved through the dancer's stretch I had watched many times before. Then, instead of our usual brisk walk, we ran for an hour. Then, we performed the K10 with Tempe correcting my endless mistakes. Then we walked a mile. Finally, we sat and discussed the Lethani. The fact that these discussions were in Ademic did not make matters easier, but we agreed I should immerse myself in the language so when I reached Haert, I could speak as a civilized person.
I just need to,
What is the purpose of the Lethani? Tempe asked.
I need to get in the groove.
To give us a path to follow, I replied. No, Tempe said sternly. The Lethani is not a path. What is the purpose of the Lethani, Tempe? To guide us in our actions. By following the Lethani, you act rightly. Is this not a path?
No. What happened to Maltese?
The Lethani is what helps us choose a path.
Today? I did hear that.
Then we would begin the cycle again. Run an hour, perform the K10, walk a mile, discuss the Lethani. It took about 2 hours, and after our brief discussion was finished, we began again. At one point in our discussion of the Lethani, I began to make the gesture for understatement. But Tempe lay his hand on top of mine, stopping me. When we are having talk about the Lethani, you are to make none of this. His left hand moved quickly through excitement, negation, and several other gestures I didn't recognize. Why? Tempe thought for a moment. When you speak of Lethani, it should not come from here. He tapped on my head. Or here.
What's up, Ditto?
He tapped on my chest over my heart and ran his fingers down to my left hand.
As soon as I woke up, that was all I saw.
True knowing of the Lethani lives deeper, lives here. He prodded me in the stomach below my navel. You must speak from here without thinking. As we continued, I slowly came to understand the unspoken rules to our discussions. Not only was it intended to teach me the Lethani, it was supposed to reveal how deeply rooted understanding of the Lethani had become within me. That meant questions were to be answered quickly, with none of the deliberate pauses that usually marked Ademic conversation. You were not supposed to give a thoughtful answer. You were supposed to give an earnest one. If you truly understood the Lethani, that knowledge would become obvious in your answers. Run, K10, walk, discuss. We completed the cycle 3 times before our midday break. 6 hours. I was covered in sweat and half convinced I would die.
Because I had music playing.
After an hour to rest and eat, we were off again. We finished another 3 cycles before we stopped for the night. We made camp by the side of the road. I chewed my supper half asleep, spread my blanket, and wrapped myself in my shade.
Wait, hold up.
In my exhausted state, it seemed soft and warm as a down eider. In the middle of the night, Tempe shook me awake. Though some deep animal part of me hated him, I knew it was necessary as soon as I stirred. My body was stiff and aching, but the slow, familiar movements of the K10 helped loosen my tight muscles. He made me stretch and drink water. Then I slept like a stone for the remainder of the night. The second day was worse. Even strapped tightly to my back, my loot became a miserable burden. The sword I couldn't even use dragged at my hip. My travel sack felt heavy as a millstone, and I regretted not letting Dedan take the mayor's box. My muscles were rubbery and disloyal, and when we ran, my breath burned in my throat. The moments when Tempe and I spoke of Lethani were the only real rest, but they were disappointingly brief. My mind spun with exhaustion, and it took all my concentration to pull my thoughts into order, trying to give proper answers. Even so, my responses only irritated him. Time after time he shook his head, explaining how I was wrong. Eventually, I gave up trying to be right. Too weary to care, I quit pulling my exhausted thoughts into order and simply enjoyed sitting down for a few minutes. I was too wary to remember what I said half the time, but surprisingly, Tempe found those answers more to his liking. That was a blessing. When my answers pleased him, our discussions lasted longer, and I could spend more time resting. I felt considerably better the third day. My muscles no longer ached as badly.
No, I can't hear a
My
thing.
breath came easier.
Oh, he's
My
already
head
rezzed.
felt
Nice.
clear and
I
light,
didn't hear it.
like a leaf floating on the wind. In this frame of
I
mind,
just
answers
heard
to
that.
Tempe's questions tripped easily off the tip of my tongue, simple as singing. Run, K10, walk, discuss. 3 cycles. Then, as we moved through the K10 on the side of the road, I collapsed. Tempe had been watching closely and caught me before I hit the ground. My world spun dizzily for a few minutes before I realized I was in the shade of a tree at the side of the road. Tempe must have carried me there. He held out my water skin. Drink. The thought of water was not appealing, but I took a mouthful anyway. I am sorry, Tempe. He shook his head. You came far before falling. You did not complain. You showed your mind is stronger than your body. That is good. When the mind controls the body, that is of the Lethani. But knowing your limit is also of the Lethani. It is better to stop when you must than run until you fall.
24 decibels.
Unless falling is what
But
the
you guys are
Lethani
hearing is
requires, I said without
1/10 of
thinking.
how loud I'm hearing it.
My head
I
still
can't-
felt light as a
When I
wind-blown
tell you that I
leaf.
couldn't hear a thing, like,
He gave me a
I'll
rare
turn it up all
smile.
the way.
Yes, you are beginning to see. I returned his
You know what I'm
smile.
saying? Like,
Your return is coming very well, Tempe. Tempe blinked. Worry. We are speaking my language, not yours.
like, I couldn't hear a fucking
I'm not
word,
speaking-
bro, or like not
I started
a word,
to protest,
like, not a
but as I
fucking
did, I listened to the words I was using. Skeopateias. My head reeled for a moment. Drink again, Tempe said, and though his face and voice were carefully controlled, I could tell he was concerned. I took another sip to pacify him. Then, as if my body suddenly realized it needed the water,
Anderson.
I became very thirsty and took several large swallows. I stopped before I drank too much and cramped my stomach. Tempe nodded,
It's
approval.
definitely the music's fault.
Am I speaking well, then? I said to distract myself from my thirst. You are speaking well for a child. Very well for a barbarian. Only well? Am I making the words wrong? You touch eyes too much. He widened his eyes and stared pointedly into my own, unblinking. Also, your words are good but simple.
No, I didn't get my hair cut. I just
You
have it
must
down.
teach me more words then. He shook his head, serious. You already know too many words. Too many? Tempe, I know very few. It is not the words, it is their use. In Adem there is an art to speaking. There are those who can say many things in one thing. My Cheyenne is such. They say a thing in one breath,
Yikes.
and others will find meaning in it for a year. Gentle reproach. Too often you say more than you need. You should not speak in Ademic as you sing in a Turin. 100 words to praise a woman. Too many. Our talk is smaller.
You heard it here first.
So when I meet a
Well, that
woman,
Octane's fucking
I should
dead.
simply say, you are beautiful?
That guy's gonna
Tempe
repeat
shook his
because
head.
Octane's dead.
No. You would say simply beautiful and let the
Or
woman
fucking
decide
not.
the rest of what you mean. Isn't that
Are you jumping?
I didn't know the words for vague or
Stop
unspecific and had to start again to get my point across. Doesn't that lead to confusion? It leads to thoughtfulness, he said firmly. It is delicate. That should always be the concern when one is speaking. To be too much talking. He shook his head.
God, you see that guy just
disapproval.
fucking teleport?
It is...
What was that shit?
He stalled, searching for a word. Rude? Negation. Frustration. I go to Severin, and there are people who stink. There are people who do not. Both are people, but those who do not stink are people of quality. He tapped my chest firmly with 2 fingers. You are not a goat herd.
Song, by the way.
You are a student of the Letani. My student. You should speak as a person of quality. But what about clarity? What if you were building a bridge? There are many pieces to that. All of them must be said clearly. Of course, Tempe said, agreement. Sometimes. But in most things, important things, delicate is better. Small is better.
Attorney, yes, sir.
Tempe reached out and gripped my shoulder firmly. Then he looked up, met my eye, and held it for a brief moment. Such a rarity for him. He gave a small, quiet smile.
Oh, this is gonna be a banger. I can already hear it.
Proud,
I hear it.
He said.
Feel it. It's gonna be a banger.
The remainder of the day was spent in recovery. We would walk a few miles, perform the K-10, discuss the Lethani, then walk again. We stopped at a roadside inn that evening where I ate enough for 3 men and fell into bed before the sun had left the sky. The next day, we went back to the cycles, but only 2 before midday and 2 after. My body burned and ached, but I was no longer delirious with exhaustion. Fortunately, with a little mental effort, I could slide back into that strange, anticipatory clear-headedness I'd used to answer Tempe's questions the day before. Over the next couple of days, I came to think of that odd mental state as spinning leaf.
Bro. EDM music during breaks gets the
It seemed like a distant cousin to Heart of Stone, the mental exercise I'd learned so long ago. That said, there was little similarity between the two. Heart of Stone was practical. It stripped away emotion and focused my mind. It made it easier to break my mind into separate pieces or maintain the all-important alar. On the other hand, spinning leaf seemed largely useless. It was relaxing to let my mind grow clear and empty, then float and tumble lightly from one thing to the next. But aside from helping me draw answers to Tempe's questions out of thin air, it seemed to have no practical value. It was the mental equivalent of a card trick.
Oh, shit!
By the 8th day on the road, my body no longer ached constantly. That was when Tempe added something new. After performing the K-10, the 2 of us would fight. It was hard, as that was when I was the most weary. But after the fighting, we would always sit, rest, and discuss the Lethani. Why did you smile as we fought today? Tempe would say. Because I was happy. Did you enjoy the fighting? Yes. Tempe radiated displeasure. That is not of the Lethani. I thought for a moment on my next question. Should a man take pleasure in the fight? No. You take pleasure in acting rightly and following the Lethani. What if following the Lethani requires me to fight? Should I not take pleasure in it? No. You should take pleasure in following the Lethani. If you fight well, you should take pride in doing a thing well. For the fighting itself, you should feel only duty and sorrow. Only barbarians and madmen take pleasure in combat. Whoever loves the fight itself has left the Lethani behind. On the 11th day, Tempe showed me how to incorporate my sword into the K-10. The first thing I learned was how quickly a sword becomes lead-heavy when held at arm's length. With our sparring and the addition of the sword, each cycle took nearly 2.5 hours. Still, we kept to our schedule every day. 3 cycles before noon, 3 cycles after. 15 hours in all.
Dude,
I could feel my body hardening, becoming quick and lean like Tempe's. So we ran, and I learned, and Hert drew ever closer.
you see some outlandish shit
Chapter 110, Beauty and Branch. As we traveled, we moved quickly through towns, stopping only for food and water. The countryside was a blur. My mind was focused on the Khaitan, the Lethani, and the language I was learning. The road became narrower as we made our way into the foothills of the storm wall. The land grew rocky and jagged, and the road began to snake back and forth as it avoided box valleys, bluffs, and jumbles of broken rock. The air changed, growing cooler than I expected in summer. We finished the trip in 15 days. At my best guess, we covered almost 300 miles in that time. Heort was the first Adem town I'd ever seen, and to my inexperienced eye, it hardly seemed a town at all. There was no central street lined with houses and shops.
Is it just me? Okay, so
What buildings I did see were widely spaced, oddly shaped, and built to fit closely with the natural shape of the land, as if they were trying to keep out of sight. I didn't know that the powerful storms that gave the mountain range its name were common here. Their sudden changing winds would tear apart anything so upthrust and angular as the square timber houses common in the lands below.
I see a Watson fence.
Instead, the Adem built sensibly, hiding their buildings from the weather. Homes were built into the sides of hills, or outward from the leeward walls of sheltering cliffs. Some were dug downward. Others were carved into the stony sides of bluffs. Some you could hardly see unless you were standing next to them. The exception was a group of low stone buildings clustered close together some distance from the road. We stopped outside the largest of these. Tempe turned to face me, tugging nervously at the leather straps holding his mercenary reds tight to his arms. I must go and make my introductions to Cheyenne. It may be some time. Anxiety, regret. You must wait here, perhaps long. His body language told me more than his words. I cannot take you inside, as you are a barbarian. I will wait, I reassured him. He nodded and went inside, glancing back at me before closing the door behind himself. I looked around, watching a few people quietly going about their business. A woman carrying a basket, a young boy leading a goat by a piece of rope. The buildings were made of the same rough stone as the landscape, blending into their surroundings. The sky was overcast, adding another shade of gray. The wind blew over everything, snapping around corners and making patterns in the grass. I thought briefly of pulling on my shade, but decided against it. The air was thinner here, and cooler, but it was still summer, and the sun was warm. It felt oddly peaceful here, with none of the clamor and stink of a larger town. No clatter of hooves on cobblestones. No cart vendors singing out their wares. I could imagine someone like Tempe growing up in a place like this, soaking in the quiet until he was full of it, then taking it with him when he left. With little else to look at, I turned to the nearby building. It was made from uneven pieces of stone pieced together like a jigsaw. Looking closer, I was puzzled by the lack of mortar. I tapped it with a knuckle, wondering briefly if it might be a single piece of stone carved to look like many stones fit together. Behind me, I heard a voice say in Ademic, "What do you think of our wall?" I turned to see an older woman with the characteristic pale gray eyes of the Adem. Her face was impassive, but her features were kind and motherly. She wore a yellow woolen cap pulled down over her ears.
How do you feel like
it was roughly knitted, and the sandy hair that stuck out from underneath was starting to go white. After all this time traveling with Tempe, it was odd to see an Adem who wasn't strapped into tight mercenary reds and wearing a sword. This woman wore a loose-fitting white shirt and linen pants. "Is it fascinating, our wall?" she asked, gesturing gentle amusement, curiosity, with one hand. "What do you think of it?" "I think it is beautiful," I responded in Ademic, careful to make only brief eye contact.
Stay back, man.
Her hand tilted in an unfamiliar gesture.
Not, like,
"Beautiful?"
No.
I gave the barest of shrugs. "There is beauty that belongs to simple things of function." Perhaps you are mistaking a word, she said. Gentle apology. Beauty is a flower or a woman or a gem. Perhaps you mean to say utility. Of all is useful.
Put the measuring
Useful,
in there, that's funny.
but beautiful as well. Perhaps a thing gains beauty being used. Perhaps a thing is used according to its beauty, I countered, wondering if this was the Adem equivalent of small talk. If it was, I preferred it to the insipid gossip of the mayor's court.
What are my thoughts on it?
What of my hat?
I don't know.
She asked, touching it with a hand.
I just
Is it
think that I'm
beautiful because it
overdoing
is
it.
used?
I don't know.
It was knitted from a thick homespun wool and dyed a bright corn silk yellow. It was slightly lopsided, and its
What's up, Louise?
stitching was uneven in places. It seems very warm, I said carefully. She gestured, small amusement, and her eyes twinkled ever so slightly. It is that, she said, and to me it is beautiful as it was made for me by my daughter's daughter. Then it is beautiful as well. Agreement. The woman hand-smiled at me.
All right.
Her hand
Well,
tilted
no,
differently than Tempe's when she made the gesture, and I decided to take it as a fond, motherly smile. Keeping my face blank, I gestured a smile in return, doing my best to make it both warm and polite. You speak well for a barbarian, she said, and reached out to grip my arms in a friendly gesture.
No, so you don't understand.
Visitors are rare,
Yesterday.
especially those so courteous. Come with me, and I will show you beauty, and you will speak to me of what its use might be. I looked down. Regret. I cannot. I am waiting. For one inside? I nodded. If they have gone inside, I suspect you will be waiting some time. Certainly they would be pleased if you came with me. I may prove more entertaining than of all. The old woman lifted her arm and caught the attention of a young boy. He trotted over and looked up at her expectantly, his eyes darting briefly to my hair. She made several gestures to the boy, but I only understood quietly. Tell those inside I am taking this man for a walk so he need not stand alone in the wind. I will return him shortly. She tapped my loot case, then did the same to my travel sack and the sword on my hip.
They don't see me. They don't see me.
Give these to the boy, and he will
I think they
take
see me
them
now.
inside for you. Without waiting for me to reply, she began to tug my travel sack off my shoulder, and I couldn't think of a graceful way of disengaging myself without seeming terribly impolite. Every culture is different, but one thing is always true. The surest way to give offense is to refuse the hospitality of your host. The boy scurried off with my things, and the old woman took my arm, leading me away. I resigned myself somewhat gratefully to her company, and we walked quietly until we came to a deep valley that opened suddenly in front of us. It was green, with a stream at the bottom, and sheltered from the persistent wind.
Ready for you.
What would you say of such a thing? She asked, gesturing to the hidden
right?
valley. It is
Yep,
much
make it
like
up
a
for a
Demre. She patted my arm affectionately. You have the gift of saying without saying. That is rare for one as you are. She began to make her way down into the valley, keeping one hand on my arm for support as she stepped carefully along a narrow, rocky path that twisted along the valley wall. I spotted a young boy with a herd of sheep not too far off. He waved to us, but did not call out. We made our way to the valley bottom where the stream rolled white over stones. It made clear pools where I could see the ripples of fish stirring in the water. Would you call this beautiful? She asked after we had looked a while. Yes. Why? Uncertainty. Perhaps its movement. The stone moved not at all, and you called it beautiful as well? Questioning. It is not the nature of stone to move. Perhaps it is beauty to move according to your nature. She nodded, as if my answer pleased her. We continued to watch the water. Have you heard of the Latanta? She asked.
I feel old. Man says no,
No.
wife.
Regret.
I don't either.
But perhaps I simply do not know the word.
Is that a bad thing?
She turned, and we made our way along the valley floor until we came to a wider spot with the carefully groomed look of a garden. In the center of it was a tall tree, the like of which I had never seen before. We stopped at the edge of the clearing.
What?
This is the sword
honestly,
tree,
I don't put it
she
past
said,
trees, to be honest.
and made a gesture I did not recognize, brushing the back of her hand against her cheek.
Talking about that you have
The
a wife?
letanta. Would you say it is
Why
beautiful?
would you go ahead and do that?
I watched it for a moment. Curiosity.
Eh.
I would enjoy seeing it more closely.
Hold up, I got something. You ready?
That is not allowed. Emphatic.
Get jealous.
I nodded and watched it as well as I
jealous?
could from this distance. It had high, arching branches like an oak, but its leaves were broad, flat, and spun in odd circles when they caught the wind. Yes, I answered after a long while.
You mean nah?
Why did it take you so long to decide?
Jelly? Well,
I was considering the reason
Talk
for
your
its
wife
beauty,
nice.
I admitted. And? I could say it both moves and doesn't move according to its nature, and that grants it beauty. But I do not think that is the reason. Why, then? I watched it for a long time. I do not know. What do you consider the reason? It simply is, she said. That is enough. I nodded, feeling slightly foolish about the elaborate answers I'd given before. Do you know of the Keiten? She asked, surprising me. I now had an inkling of how important such things were to the Adem, so I hesitated to give an open answer. However, I did not want to lie either. Perhaps. Apology. She nodded. You are cautious.
What the?
Yes. Are you Cheyenne? Cheyenne nodded. When did you suspect me of being who I am? When you asked of the Keiten,
What the fuck?
I said. When did you suspect me of knowing more than a barbarian should? When I saw you set your feet. Another silence. Cheyenne, why do you not wear the red like other mercenaries? She made a pair of unfamiliar gestures.
I do have questions as to what that guy was
Has
doing.
your
but
teacher told you why they wear the red? I did not think to ask, I said, not wanting to imply Tempe had neglected my training. I ask you then. I thought for a moment. So their enemies will not see them bleed? Approval. Why then do I wear white? The only answer I could
just
think
give up on
of
his
chilled
thought.
me. Because you do not bleed? She gave a partial nod. Also, because if an enemy draws my blood, she should see it as her fair reward. I fretted silently, doing my best to mimic proper Adem composure. After an appropriately polite pause, I asked, What will become of Tempe?
What's up, Lauren?
That remains to be seen.
Oh, okay.
She gestured something close to irritation, then asked, Are you not concerned for yourself? I am more concerned for Tempe. The sword tree spun patterns on the wind. It was almost hypnotic. How far have you come in your training?
Hell no.
Cheyenne asked. I have studied the Keiten for a month. She turned to face me and raised her hands. Are you ready? I could not help but think that she was shorter than me by 6 inches and old enough to be my grandmother. Her lopsided yellow hat didn't make her look terribly intimidating either. Perhaps,
Ow.
I said, and raised my hands as well. Cheyenne came toward me slowly, making hands like knives. I countered with catching rein. Then I made climbing iron and fast inward, but could not touch her. She quickened slightly, made turning breath, and striking forward at the same time. I stopped one with fan water, but couldn't escape the other. She touched me below my ribs, then on my temple, softly as you would press a finger to someone's lips. Nothing I tried had any effect on her. I made thrown lightning, but she simply stepped away, not even bothering to counter. Once or twice I felt the brush of cloth against my hands as I came close enough to touch her white shirt, but that was all. It was like trying to strike a piece of hanging string. I set my teeth and made threshing wheat, pressing cider, and mother at the stream, moving seamlessly from one to the other in a flurry of blows. She moved like nothing I had ever seen. It wasn't that she was fast, though she was fast, but that was not the heart of it. Cheyenne moved perfectly, never taking 2 steps when one would do, never moving 4 inches when she only needed 3. She moved like something out of a story, more fluid and graceful than Felurian dancing. Hoping to catch her by surprise and prove myself, I moved as fast as I dared. I made maiden dancing, catching sparrows, 15 wolves. Cheyenne took one single perfect step.
He's like challenging me. He's like, pull up.
"Why do you weep?" Cheyenne asked as she made heron falling. "Are you ashamed? Are you in fear?" I blinked my eyes to clear them. My voice was harsh from the exertion and emotion. "You are beautiful, Cheyenne, for in you is the stone of the wall, the water of the stream, and the motion of the tree in one." Cheyenne blinked, and in her moment of surprise, I found myself firmly gripping her shoulder and arm. I made thunder upward, but instead of being thrown, Cheyenne stood still and solid as a stone. Almost absent-mindedly, she freed herself with Break Lion and made threshing wheat. I flew 6 feet and hit the ground. I was up quickly with no harm done. It was a gentle throw on soft turf, and Tempe had taught me how to fall without hurting myself. But before I could advance again, Cheyenne stopped me with a gesture. "Tempe has both taught you and not taught you," she said, her expression unreadable.
Where did
I forced my eyes away from her face again. So hard to break that lifetime's worth of habit, which is both bad and good. Come. She turned and walked closer to the tree. It was bigger than I had thought. The smaller branches moved in wild, curving patterns as the wind tossed them about. Cheyenne picked up a fallen leaf and handed it to me. It was broad and flat, the size of a small plate, and surprisingly heavy. My hand stung, and I saw a thin line of blood trailing down my thumb. I examined the edge of the leaf and saw it was rigid, its edge as sharp as a blade of grass. Sword tree indeed. I looked up at the spinning leaves. Anyone standing near the tree when the wind was high would be cut to ribbons. Cheyenne said, "If you were to attack this tree, what would you do? Would you strike the root? No. Too strong. Would you strike the leaf? No. Too fast.
Having long hair is
Where then?
Bullshit.
The branch. The branch. Agreement. She turned to me. That is what Tempe has not taught you. It would have been wrong for him to teach you that. Nevertheless, you have suffered for it. I don't understand. She gestured for me to begin the K-10. Automatically, I fell in to catch sparrows. Stop. I froze in position.
I feel like I would get annoyed. I'm already annoyed with how
If I am to attack you, where should it be? Here, at the root. She pushed my leg and found it unyielding. Here, at the leaf.
I wouldn't be able to do that.
She pushed at my upheld hand, moving it easily, but accomplishing little else. Here, the branch. She pushed gently against one of my shoulders, moving me easily. And here. She added pressure to my hip, spinning me around. Do you see? You find the place to spend your strength, or it is wasted. Wasting strength is not of the Lethani. Yes, Cheyenne. She raised her hands, falling into the position where I had caught her before, midway through heron falling. Make thunder upward. There is my root. I pointed to her solidly planted feet. Where is the leaf? I pointed to her hands. No. From here to here is the leaf. She indicated her whole arm and demonstrated how she could freely strike with her hands, elbows, or shoulders. Where is the branch?
I literally don't. I don't have no
I
bullets.
thought for a long moment, then tapped her knee.
I just shoot
Though
3
she
separate
gave no
people with,
sign
like,
of it,
20 bullets.
I sensed her surprise. And? I tapped her opposite side, under her armpit, then her shoulder.
You know's bald?
Show me.
Oh, unfortunate.
I came in close to her, set one leg close against her knee, and made thunder upward, throwing her to the side. I was surprised at how little force was required.
Dude, he just came down, he
However, instead of being thrown into the air to tumble to the ground, Shane gripped my forearm. I felt a jolt run up my arm and was pulled one staggering step to the side. Rather than being thrown, Shane used her grip as leverage so her feet came down beneath her. She took a single, perfect step and had her balance again. Shane looked me straight in the eye for a long, speculative moment, then turned to leave, gesturing for me to follow. Chapter 111. A Liar and a Thief. Cheyenne and I returned to the complex of stone buildings to find Tempe standing outside, shifting nervously from foot to foot. That confirmed my suspicion. He hadn't sent Cheyenne to test me. She had found me on her own. When we came close enough, Tempe held his sword out in his right hand, point down. His left hand gestured, elaborate respect. Cheyenne, he said. Cheyenne motioned for him to follow as she entered the low stone building. She motioned to a young boy.
Who out here wanted feet in the first place?
Fetch Carceret. The boy took off running.
Am I the only one that
Curiosity.
half the people that
I
say
gestured
they like
to
feet
Tempe.
don't actually like feet?
He didn't look at
I
me.
just think it's funny.
Profound seriousness. Attend. It didn't reassure me that these were the same gestures he had made on the road to Crossan when he thought we were walking into an ambush. His hands, I noticed, were shaking slightly.
It's kind of like a joke.
Cheyenne led us to an open doorway where a woman in mercenary reds joined us. I recognized the thin scars on her eyebrow and jaw. This was Carceret, the mercenary we had met while heading to Severin, the one who had pushed me. Cheyenne motioned the two mercenaries inside, but held up a hand to me.
Wait, are these people telling the truth that they actually like feet? Okay, but like, what are we talking about? Like pretty feet, like. Like I could agree that Shane like you got some ugly ass feet is definitely a turn off, but like I wouldn't be like, damn, your feet are so nice. Like, you know? But ugly feet on anybody are attractive. I think that just has to do with like